Welcome, welcome. So it's getting better all the time. Mental health outreach. We are just want to make sure everything is set. Just give me a minute here. I hope everyone is doing well and having a great mental health day. Again, this is It's Getting Better All the Time Mental Health Outreach with your host, Sister A. Legree. You can find out more about us by logging onto our website at igbattmho.org. You can email us at support@igbattmho.org. Again, It's Getting Better All the Time Mental Health Outreach, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith. And this morning, I just wanted to talk about, just briefly, the topic is calling for help is not being judgmental. And what I mean is that if you are in a position where you need to call for help for someone who is having a psychotic episode or who is having some type of mental health crisis, it's okay to do that. There are a lot of people who, for various reasons, feel that they don't, they're nervous about doing it, they're unsure about doing it, or they just don't do it for whatever reason. And I want you to know that it's okay, because if you saw someone bleeding on the side of the street, if you saw someone seem to be having a heart attack, you wouldn't hesitate to get help for that person, to at least call 911. And I'm encouraging you to look at, when we talk about serious and persistent mental illnesses, we're talking about chronic illnesses that have to be managed. And just like any chronic illness, there may be times when you may have quote-unquote flare-ups or episodes. In that particular moment, when a person is having a flare-up or an episode, they may not be able to think clearly, to process clearly, and they will need somebody to help. Just like if a person was having, if I was diagnosed with a heart condition and then suddenly I had a heart attack, right? You wouldn't say, oh, no, I'm not going to do it because, that's her choice if she doesn't want to go to the hospital. No, you would call, 911. That's what we're talking about here. It's okay to call for help. So let me start off by saying this. People with untreated serious mental illnesses we like to say people living with a serious and persistent mental illness are no more violent than anyone else. And that's true. With the exception, individuals who are living with a serious and persistent mental illness who are actively psychotic, who are taking drugs, who are not taking their medications, need help, right? So again, how do you live with someone? And my second title, living next door to someone with a serious mental illness. I had an opportunity, and I thought about this because we had an opportunity yesterday to be in a situation where a person is living in an apartment complex, and we've had it where a person was living in a home, but they're living around other people, and they are actively psychotic, and they're in the building, they're in the house. And the question is, what do I do as a neighbor? What do I do as the person that's living next door? How do I handle this? There's a fine line between being a good neighbor and being, intrusive or being a nosy neighbor. So let me start from this, okay? What is it like living next door to a person with a serious mental illness, or living on the same block, in the same building complex, same house? What is that like? Well, first of all, if a person there's no difference, right? So if a person is taking their medication, because remember, when we talk about serious and persistent mental illnesses, we're talking about chronic illnesses that have to be managed, just like diabetes, just like hypertension. So we're not talking about something that can't be managed. We're talking about a disease that has fluctuations in symptoms. We have a disease that may have different episodes, that may require medications, just like anything else. It may require the individual who is living with serious and persistent symptoms to manage their symptoms, just like you would have to manage diabetes. So, number one, if you're living next door to someone, or in a building complex, or in a housing subdivision with someone who's living with a serious and persistent mental illness, there will be no difference. They'll just be just like any other neighbor, right? You won't even know the difference. However, so the question is, how will you know? You know because of my third point here, when the symptoms, there are untreated symptoms, exceed the confines of their apartment, when their symptoms exceed the confines of their home, of their block, that's when other people begin to know. Because people living with a serious and persistent mental illness, and who are managing their symptoms are just like you, me, just like everybody else. For the most part, you won't really know the difference, right? So again, just because, yeah, you may have somebody living next door to you with a serious and persistent mental illness, such as schizophrenia and bipolar, and as we talked about before, when we use the term serious and persistent mental illnesses, we're talking about those illnesses that belong to a certain category, those illnesses that are so severe and so persistent that they impact all aspects of an individual's life, right? These are illnesses that usually start when the person is much younger, so it impacts, how they parent, it impacts how they, their ability to go to school, their marriage, it impacts all aspects of an individual's life. So because of that, and also when we talk about serious and persistent mental illnesses, these are illnesses that have a special category from the federal government, right? So, because people will say, well, all illnesses are serious and persistent. Not necessarily. I mean, if you're the person living with, say, anxiety or with an adjustment disorder or, something like that, yeah, it's serious, right, to you. But because we recognize there are a certain category of illnesses, because of their impact on the individual's life, they are severe, they are persistent, we have a special category for them. And we meaning, the federal government. So serious and persistent mental illnesses, individuals living with SMI represent a small population. It is not a whole lot, but the impact, the burden, that their illness has on them and everyone else can be huge. So again, going back to my point, how do you know that you're living next door or on the block or in your neighborhood with someone who has a serious and persistent mental illness? Normally you wouldn't know. The only way you would know is when and if the symptoms of their illness exceed the confines of their home. It exceeds the confines of their block. What do I mean, right? If you have a situation like, I witnessed yesterday where you have an individual who with serious and persistent mental illness knocked out an entire front window, right? Where people are coming in and out of the building. So everybody now knows, we see this person. If you have someone in your building who is, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, is knocking on everybody's door, who's going into the laundry room and making noise, or they're yelling and screaming in the hallway, or they're, walking up and down cursing, or they're, otherwise their symptoms of their illness have exceeded the confines of the apartment or the confines of their the neighborhood. So now we have a problem. So number one, you want to look at it just like anything else. If this was a drunk person, right, person who was intoxicated, and they were knocking on the doors, waking everybody up, what would you do, right? If this was a person who was being inappropriate with the kids in the building, or who was, yelling at people, screaming at people, what would you do? So again, you always want to remember that there's pretty much no difference. You may have to call someone just like you normally would. So again, when we're talking about the first thing you want to realize, and let me stay here, okay? So if the symptoms are exceeding the confines of the apartment or home, means that now there are problems within the neighborhood, there are problems within the apartment complex, there are problems within the milieu, the community milieu. So now, what do we do, okay? First thing that you want to do is that there are a couple of things, right? There's no cookie cutter answer. It depends on the situation. You want to always remember that individuals with serious and persistent mental illness are no more dangerous than anyone else. However, if that person requires medications, and if they're off their medications, or if that person is taking drugs or substances, they could become more, it could be a problem, could become more challenging. So number one, you always want to be mindful of your safety, right? Let's just say you're in you're getting off out of your apartment or out of your home, let's say your apartment, and you're getting into the elevator, and then you see someone who is maybe yelling, screaming, that makes you feel uncomfortable. Common sense will say, okay, well, I'm not going to get in the elevator. But what happens is, because many people are so nice and they're so kind, their thought process is, well, I don't want to, do that. I don't want to feel like, I'm being judgmental. I don't want to feel like I'm being prejudiced. I don't want to feel, I don't want the person to feel a certain way. I want you to understand that when you see a person who is actively psychotic, that person needs help, right? And you may or may not be the person that can give them that direct help, but you can be the person who can call to get them help, right? So again, number one, when we're talking about, and we're going to talk about de-escalation, is that you always want to make sure to evaluate your safety. Your safety is number one, right? You get in the elevator with that person because you're trying to prove a point. You don't want to feel like people think that you're, like I said, judgmental, or feel like you're, being prejudiced, or, you want to always want to present like nothing's wrong. You want to be honest, because here's the thing: when a person is actively psychotic in that particular moment, it's nothing personal, but they could begin to respond to the internal stimuli in a way that would not be helpful to you. So number one, you always want to protect your safety, protect yourself. So that's number one. How you want to remain calm as possible. I'm reading from some of my notes here. Remain as calm as possible. You want to speak to the person slowly in a confident manner. You want to try not to talk too fast. And I always tell people, I'm from the South, I talk fast, but I always try to remember that. You want to speak slowly. You want to be confident as you speak. You want to, if you need to remove yourself from the situation, that's always number one. So you always want to evaluate the situation. Number one, am I going to get in this elevator with this person? Am I going to walk down the steps with this person? Is it safe for me to remain in the environment with this individual? Okay? So you always want to think about that, right? And if you don't feel safe, it's okay to remove yourself. There's no shame. You're not trying to prove a point. You're not trying to get a badge or some kind of award or something, right? You remove yourself from the situation, and then you can always get on the phone and call 911. My thing is about safety first, your safety, your safety, and then the person's safety. And what does that mean? That means you may have to call 911. You may have to call a crisis team. You may have to call for help. What I'm encouraging you to do is call for help, because at that moment, when that person is actively psychotic, they don't understand. They may not realize that they need help at that moment, right? But it's up to you. There's nothing wrong with calling for help. Okay, let's just say you're talking to the person slowly and confidently with a gentle, caring manner. Do not respond in a hostile manner. Don't argue. Try not to threaten the individual. Avoid raising your voice or talking too fast. Be aware that the person may overreact to negative words. Okay. Stay calm. Avoid nervous behavior. Don't restrict the person's movement. This is a big thing, and especially if you're in a home with someone who's actively psychotic. Don't restrict their movement. If they want to walk away, let them walk away. If they want to leave the room, let them leave the room. Don't jump in front of them and try to block them, right? Remain aware that certain acts, such as involving law enforcement, right, and again, if you're in a home with someone, you want to have to ask yourself, is this something that we need to call law enforcement about or not call law enforcement? And as I talked about before, let's just say you're with your loved one in a home, right? And the situation begins to exacerbate, and you feel like you need to call. I always encourage people, first of all, let them know, say, hey, right now it seems da-da-da-da-da-da, and I may have to call the police in order to get us some help. Or I may have to call the crisis team to get us some help. And what the crisis team is going to do, what the police are going to do, they're going to come and try to help us, right? So if you do have to call, it's okay, if you can, to let them know that you're going to call and explain to them the role of the police, the role of the crisis team. Hey, they're just coming to kind of help us, right? They're coming, to help us, because right now it seems like you might be a little anxious. You might be upset, and we just want to see what we can do. We want to get help, right? So again, sometimes you may have to step away, but again, I want to stay with my first scenario was that you're in the elevator, you're in your apartment complex, you're in the elevator, and you run across one of your neighbors who's actively psychotic. Number one, you might want to remove yourself from the situation and then go back to your house, your apartment, and make a phone call. And you can call, and when you call 911, if you have to, you can say, let them know clearly what's going on. Hey, the person is not violent, right? From what I can tell, they need some help, right? It's a medical emergency. That's how you want to phrase it. If you're talking about someone who's actively psychotic, it's a medical emergency. That's what you want to say to the 911 operator if you have to call them. Now, let's just say you are already in the elevator and the person comes into the elevator, they're actively psychotic, right? In that situation, if they're not talking to you, you don't necessarily have to talk with them, right? But if they start talking to you, this is where I was talking about speaking in a calm manner, speak calm, right? You want to try to avoid the situation, right? You want to try not to be nervous or anxious. You want to, press the button to the elevator, maybe to get off on the next floor. So there's certain things that you want to do. It can be challenging when you're living with someone as a neighbor, right, who is actively psychotic because of the behaviors that they are doing, the behaviors that you're seeing, behaviors that have now exceeded the confines of their apartment, the confines of their home. And now it's a neighborhood problem. Now it's a community issue. Well, what you want to do is, as I said, realize that this person needs help. Realize that they're not doing, if they were not actively psychotic, they wouldn't be engaging in the type of behaviors that they're engaging in. Realize that this person needs help. Just like if this person was bleeding out, they realize that they need help, right? So again, in a crisis situation, remain as calm as possible. Evaluate the situation by assessing the risk involved. What's the risk to myself? What's the risk to this? Number one, your safety is always a concern. What is the risk to myself if I'm confined with this person, if I'm in an elevator, or if we are preparing to get into an elevator, or if I'm living with the person, right? What are the risks, okay? If the risks are minimal and you have an opportunity, you have to communicate, try to be calm, try to be firm, try not to speak in short sentences, and it's not that the person is dumb. What it is, there's this exercise I would encourage you to do, right? What you want to do is get someone, a friend of yours, right, to, do like this. Get two people, right? Have one person just talking to you in a regular, one person having a regular conversation, right? And then have another person coming up in your ear and just saying all types of things for about 20 minutes while you're trying to have the conversation. That will give you just a little glimpse of what it's like when you're actively psychotic. Because when you're actively psychotic, you're actually, you have this blah, 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 blah in your ear constantly, hearing the voices, while someone is talking to you. And you have these things going at the same time. And if you will realize from that exercise just how uncomfortable it is. I've done that exercise with people, and they have actually gotten really disturbed just doing the exercise because it was so much for them. So imagine just doing that exercise, which is only like 10 minutes, and people becoming disturbed. Imagine living that way, right? Always in your head. You can hear the voices and people are talking to you. So when you're talking, you want to talk slow because you realize what's happening is that the symptoms, especially if they're auditory hallucinations, are just going. So it's hard for them to concentrate. It's difficult to concentrate. So that's why you're talking about the agitation. Sometimes they become agitated. Sometimes people will draw because it's just too much, right? So again, be aware. So short, simple sentences. Calm. Be aware that the person might act upon the delusion or hallucination. Sometimes if they think or if they feel something in that particular moment, they may act upon it. Because when we're talking about a person that's psychotic, we're looking at a medical emergency, right? It is a medical crisis. It's a psychiatric emergency, a psychiatric crisis. Just like if a person was having a diabetic episode or a person was having an asthma attack or where a person had and they needed the EpiPen, what do you call it? A person has a reaction to a particular food and they start having, and they're going into shock, right? You had to pull out the EpiPen. Well, we don't have an EpiPen per se when a person is actively psychotic, but we do have resources in the community that can be a help. So our role as a neighbor, person living next door, as a person in the neighborhood, right? When you know you have someone in your neighborhood who is actively psychotic, our role is to get that person help. We may not be the person, but to get that person help. That's when we start calling. Okay, it's to call the crisis team. Hey, I'm calling the crisis team. I'm calling you guys because my neighbor down the hall, da 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 da. I don't want to give my name. I don't want to give my number, but this person is is having some challenges, right? You can call the police. Hey, I don't want to give my name. I don't want to give my number. This is what's going on. Too many people. We don't want to get involved, and I understand. What you don't want to do is try to be a hero, which is why number one, you always want to think about your safety, right? And when I say that, I am not saying that that's a problem, that the person who is actively psychotic is a problem. I am saying that that person at that particular moment is having a psychiatric or medical crisis that is problematic and they need help for. And because they need help, it's important that when you see that, to call. It's okay to call, right? The police are not the enemy. Actually, the police do a really good job of de-escalating situations. The only time you hear about the police having a problem when you're talking about someone who's actively psychotic is when something goes wrong, right? But think about it. When was the last time it made national news? But police take these calls all of the time, right? Unfortunately, the police are the first resort instead of being the last resort. Because the police actually should be the last resort. There should be other things in place, right? The mental health team should be in place. The crisis team should be in place. The U.S. family members and friends. You have a person who's living with who's a serious and persistent mental illness. You should already know what the resources are. If you as an individual, you're living with a serious and persistent mental illness, you know that just like any other person living with a chronic illness, what your responsibilities are, right? Your responsibility is to ensure that you are managing your symptoms, that you are, staying in contact with your treatment plan, that if you're taking medications, prescribed medications, that you're taking it, that you're having conversations with your doctor, with your treatment team, that you have a crisis plan, right? That you're managing your symptoms. Because again, serious and persistent mental illnesses can be managed. Relapse episodes don't necessarily come out of the blue, right? They don't come out of the blue. They usually been coming for a long period of time, and then when we see them, now it's a full-blown active psychosis. So again, many of you will be living with individuals next door to individuals with a serious and persistent mental illness. They're your neighbors, they're your friends, they're your family members, they're your loved ones. It's no different than living next door to anyone else. The only time it becomes a problem is when the symptoms of the serious and persistent mental illness exceeds the confines of the apartment, exceeds the confines of the home, and bleeds out into the neighborhood. Once it starts bleeding out into the neighborhood or into the apartment complex, then that's when someone will need to call for help. And it's okay. It's okay to call for help. Say, hey, my neighbor needs some support. Because what will happen is, whoever you call, whether it's the police, some places have a crisis team that will come out. If the person is not actively psychotic or actively a danger, then the crisis team will handle it. But the crisis team, I can tell you, when we go out, if the situation is unsafe, the crisis team, we're going to call the police anyway, right? So whatever route that you take, that you're helping that person to get the help that they need. So that's the thing. Don't be embarrassed or ashamed, or don't hold back from getting a person help. When you see a person that's actively psychotic, meaning psychosis, out of touch with reality, they're talking to themselves, they're yelling, they're screaming, they're knocking on doors, doing other things, then it's important for you to know that person may need some help. See it for what it is, which is a medical emergency. If you have to call 911, hey, my neighbor's having a psychiatric medical emergency, and this is what's going on. They just need help. And when the police come out, if you're able to meet the police and explain to them what's going on, fine. If you don't want to do that, that's fine too. but get the person help. Again, this has been It's Getting Better All the Time Mental Health Outreach, providing information and support while encouraging hope and faith. You can log on to our website at igbattmho.org and encouraging you to be a good neighbor. How do you be a good neighbor? If the symptoms of your loved one, of your neighbor's serious and persistent mental illness exceeds the confines of the apartment or bleeds out to the community, don't be afraid to call a crisis team, to call the 911, and to get them the help that they need. Because at that moment, they need it. At that moment, they don't have the ability to say that I need help, to realize that they need help, right? They don't have that ability. I encourage you to get the help, get them